The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, John Michael McGrath and I discuss whether Queen's Park should be approving bike lanes in Ontario cities and towns. That's on a new episode of On Poly. Then, from Ontario's gold sector to dispelling the myths around ADHD, it's the Agenda's Week in Review. Hey, partner.
Hello, sir.
Our little sugar check in there.
I want to say, Matthew alerted me to the fact that people who are just listening to this podcast might be confused as to what sugar is.
Oh, we fist bump.
It's just a fist bump.
It's our little way of saying
it's not
hello.
like you're giving me a kiss on the cheek or anything.
No, that's true. That is true. Not that I mind. I mean, if you want to start doing that, I'm okay with it.
I'm good, thanks.
Okay, just let you know. T-shirt check in here. There's a group called Wayside in Hamilton that is having a walkathon in Hamilton tomorrow morning. And with any luck, my 91-year-old father and I are going to be out doing that. They do good work at Wayside. It's a place that tries to get people who've got mental health addictions, mental health issues off the street, into treatment, and then into homes. And so that's what this shirt is all about, and I thought I should explain that.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, this being October 18th, I wanted to do something else, and that is knowing me as you do. And there's always an anniversary for something when it comes to Paikin. This is a big day on my calendar. Do you know why?
Having worked here, actually, I just passed my 10th anniversary here at TVO.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I do believe I know why. This is about a certain former premier.
It is indeed. Actually, he was called Prime Minister back in the day,
yeah,
as the job was then called. Prime Minister of Ontario, John Robarts, who died 42 years ago today. And as I do every October 18th, I went down to Parliament in Bloor, and I visited his final resting place, his gravesite. He's buried at St. James Cemetery. I do this because I guess it was, 15, 16, 17 years ago, I wrote a book about Mr. Robarts because his life, there's his headstone incidentally, his life was so Shakespearean. He had a public life that was really one of the great experiences of any premier in Ontario history. His private life by the end was absolutely tragic. If you can imagine this, Mr. Robarts was lost to suicide. His first wife drank herself to death. His 21-year-old son was lost to suicide, and his daughter died of cancer in her early 50s. You'd almost swear they were cursed by the end of it, you know. He was the premier from 1961 to 1971. That might have been Ontario's best decade ever. The budgets were balanced. We got 5 new universities. We got the whole college system. We got OISE, Ontario Institute for Studies and Education. We got this place, TVO. All of that put into place by his eventual successor, whose name was?
William Grenville Davis.
I think that's right, yes. We got Ontario Place, we got the Science Centre, we got GO Transit, we got nuclear power. All this stuff happened on John Robarts' watch. Those were the Robarts years, pretty consequential. And even though I never met the guy, I never even saw him, I like to pay my respects, so I go down there every October 18th, which is today.
It's interesting to me the extent to which Robarts, I mean, growing up, my familiarity with the name Robarts was the library at U of T.
At U of T, of course.
And the extent to which Robarts is somehow... historically, he lives in the shadow of Bill Davis, and yet I think, just the list that you just rattled off there is an argument that he really laid the foundation that Bill Davis then built upon.
No question. So. And the funny thing is, Mr. Davis, he would say encouraged, but probably insisted is the better word, that library at University of Toronto, if they wanted provincial money to help build it, needed to be named after John Robarts. He thought he was doing Mr. Robarts a solid. When John Robarts saw the Robarts Library at U of T, he said, that's the ugliest damn building in the city, and it's got my name on it. He never liked it. Anyways, JMM, a couple other quick notes here while we're on the topic of politics. We did mention last week that Ottawa Centre MPP Joel Harden is not going to run for re-election at Queen's Park. He's going to try to get elected in the federal parliament in Ottawa Centre. When we put that out there, Yasser Naqvi, who is the current Liberal MP for Ottawa Centre, texted me to say, hey, I've got the Liberal nomination and I'm going to run to try to keep my seat. So we put that on the record as
Yes,
well.
they will be facing each other. I think we phrased it a bit hypothetically because we were unsure, but yes, Yasser Naqvi will have the Liberal nomination for that riding.
And one other thing, the Speaker of the Legislature, Ted Arnott, has announced that he is not running for re-election. He has been the Speaker since 2018. He has been, get this, he's been the MPP for the Wellington-Halton Hills area of the province. You know, same area, different riding names over the years. For 34 years, he is the Dean of the current Ontario Legislature. He's had a good long run, but I guess he's had enough.
Yeah, I mean, he has had to preside over a few controversies in this most recent legislature, probably most notably the question of whether to allow the keffiyeh to be worn inside the legislative chamber. He ruled that it was a political statement that was not allowed by the very long-standing rules of the legislature. He's also had to address the question of whether the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, would be opened up. It is I think it is still currently.
It is still cladded up
behind.
Yes, on the south lawn of Queen's Park.
There's also been some controversy about him even having the job. People may remember that after the 2022 election, the Premier endorsed a different candidate to be the Speaker of the House. And it was a statement of independence from MPPs from all parties that they insisted that no, Ted Arnott would be the Speaker again. We know that, just mathematically, a number of Tories had to sort of defy the instruction from their party leader to vote for Arnott, for him to, in fact, become the Speaker. You mentioned how mild-mannered he is, and I do think it's actually difficult for me to think of. He was in opposition when I first came to Queen's Park, and the demands of being an opposition MPP are different, but he was always a very sort of genial guy, and I have a hard time imagining him being tasked with the job he would inevitably be asked to do, being like a backbench attack dog for this government. Mm-hmm. I have a hard time imagining him doing that job, or at least doing it happily.
You have a hard time imagining it because it's impossible to imagine it happening. Yeah. Mind you, when he was Speaker and he had to dress down an MPP, he did have a way of having an icy stare.
Yes.
Which you didn't want to see. Anyway, by all accounts, I think a good job as Speaker. And with that, it's off to issue one. Normally in Ontario, the province deals with big picture issues, while municipalities focus on truly local things, such as where to put bike lanes. But the current provincial government announced this week it wants to have a say on where bike lanes go. So JMM, we need the deets here, please.
Right. So we have not seen legislative text of this. We have press releases from the government to go off of, and media statements from the Minister of Transportation, Prabhat Sarkaria, on this issue. So we don't know exactly what the form of this will take, but the province is saying that municipalities who want to put new bike lanes in to city streets will have to prove to the provincial government that they are not going to unduly affect motor vehicle traffic. If people want to think of an analogy here, there is like an environmental impact statements process that cities have to go through when they want to do big infrastructure projects. If people remember the Jarvis bike lane here in Toronto, that had to go through an environmental assessment.
That went in and then it came out, didn't it?
And then it got removed with the current Premier sitting as a city councillor and voting for that measure. So again, we don't know all the details on this, but in principle, it sounds like the cities that want to put bike lanes in are going to have to do some kind of study and present data to the government to assure the government that there will not be huge traffic impacts or negative traffic impacts. It's not clear what kind of evidence will be sufficient to the government, and it's not clear what kind of guarantees there will be in the process that the minister won't just sit on an application and just not ever do anything with it.
An innocent follow-up question, if I might. This seems like a very hyper-local issue, where to put a bike lane. Why, I got to be careful how I phrase this. I don't mean this to sound too pejorative, but why should the province be sticking its nose in this kind of an issue?
Well, another way to put that is like, how could this rise to the level of provincial importance?
That's a better way of putting it. Thank you.
So let me start, as our listeners and viewers know, I am a cyclist, and you could probably guess how sympathetic that makes me towards this particular issue. So I will start by making the charitable argument for the government here that, I don't think anybody would deny that regional traffic congestion is in fact a serious issue in the GTA, particularly in Toronto. And let's think about another regional issue, right? Housing. I have made the argument both on this podcast and in writing at TVO that there are times where the government should step in and overrule municipal policies that get in the way of building more housing and more affordable housing. And so you could argue that the same principle applies here, that in cases where a municipality is taking decisions or making decisions that would make the regional congestion problem worse, it is the province's role to say, I'm sorry, this is not, in fact, a local matter. This is a matter that rises to the level of provincial importance.
And do you think these things are analogous? Housing and bike lanes?
I don't think the government can make this argument terribly credibly, because housing is the exact issue where this provincial government has let municipalities really have the leadership role, right? The premier rather notably or notoriously, depending on one's view, when asked to, for example, legalize 4-story homes and fourplexes around the province, said, no, we're not touching that, and we're going to let municipalities lead the way. There have been some province-wide measures on housing, but by and large, the government has left municipalities in control of the housing supply. So, to my mind, certainly the government cannot say that it is applying this principle consistently.
Consistency is the, what is it?
Hobgoblin of small
minds. There we go. Well, okay, so that's the policy argument. Let's take a look at the politics of this for a second, because in some respects they're quite irresistible for the Ford-led Conservatives. They know that the people who really care about cycling tend to be people who live in the old city of Toronto, as it were, or the old parts of Ottawa. They are not necessarily people who live in the inner suburbs or the suburbs or the exurbs. And as a result, if they're making the calculation in their mind, they're probably thinking to themselves, we don't care about getting the cyclist vote. We're very happy to take the votes of those who live in the Etobicoke, the Scarboroughs, the North Yorks, the outer regions of Ottawa, the 905, that kind of thing. And if that's the way the cookie crumbles, the Ford Conservatives will take that 10 times out of 10, wouldn't they?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think, I also mentioned then Councillor Doug Ford's hostility to the Jarvis bike lane. So I think this is also a bit of a familiar topic for this premier to go back to. Adding these additional steps to getting these bike lanes built, it will... it signals what side this premier is on for people who have decided that there are only that this is an issue with sides on it, motorists versus cyclists. This premier is happy to put himself and plant his flag very much in the favor of motorists. But the politics might get more interesting than this. I do want to mention that the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, which defends the interests of municipalities broadly as a class, but its members are overwhelmingly not large central cities, right? There are 444 municipalities in Ontario, and almost all of them are smaller and frequently more rural. And they put out a statement this week really decrying the provincial overreach here. I don't think they're doing that because the vast majority of rural municipalities are busy building bike lanes everywhere, but they do see it as an assault on this idea of municipal autonomy.
Yeah, I guess we should point out there are bike lanes going in Mississauga and Brampton, which are Conservative-held seats, and they're trying to create a more a more balanced, friendlier sort of transit infrastructure.
Yeah, I don't think if you asked traffic engineers or city planners, I don't think you would get a lot of people saying that the long-term answer to congestion is going to be based on cars.
Gotcha. And with that, we cycle off to issue 2. The Ontario Liberal Party is saying that the Therme Spa deal is Doug Ford's Highway 407. This after the Liberal Party claimed that building the spa will cost taxpayers $2.3 billion. JMM, I guess the suggestion here is that another Tory government is giving away a multi-billion-dollar asset to a private company. That's the gist of it, eh?
Yeah, that's the allegation. The party is claiming that $1 billion is being left on the table from lost rental revenues. This is public land. It is going to remain public land. The government is not actually selling the land to Therme, the spa operator, but the long-term lease, we've talked about this before on the podcast, has, I think, very generous terms to Therme that the Liberals are alleging one of the forms of that generosity is that Therme is being given substantially below market rent. There are reasons in policymaking generally, you would do that for a favored business, right? There, if you wanted to attract a specific industry to a specific community, you might, I think the state of Texas will frequently offer like huge tax breaks for manufacturers to locate there. And this is, in theory, you could make that argument. Whether a spa at Ontario Place deserves that kind of treatment would be the wider argument, I suspect.
Honorable people can disagree about that, I guess. If you're under the age of 40, you probably don't get the reference to the 407, so maybe I can take this opportunity to just sort of flush that out a bit.
Yes, please.
Okay, I'm going to take you back. Bob Ray's government in the early 1990s built Highway 407. It was built as a toll highway. Mr. Ray loses the 1995 election. Mike Harris comes in. They decide they want to sell Highway 407 to a private sector consortium because the $3 billion that they would get for selling that highway, they wanted to help balance that year's budget. There was a law in Ontario back then, passed by the Harris Conservatives, saying the books had to be in balance unless you go to the public through a referendum and seek an exemption. They didn't do that, so they wanted to balance the books, so they sold this public asset. Problem is, you can only sell a public asset once.
Yeah.
Now you have lost a potential revenue stream theoretically forever, which they did. Now, we later learned that the Highway 407 that they sold was probably worth 10 times what they sold it for. So we not only lost a potential revenue source forever, but we also didn't get enough for the asset either, which is, I guess, why, let me come full circle, that's why the Liberals today are saying 407 30 years ago, Therme Spa today.
The news on Ontario Place doesn't end there. The Ontario NDP have submitted a complaint to the Office of the Integrity Commissioner. Formally, the complaint was filed by NDP leader Marit Stiles, asking the Integrity Commissioner to investigate the Therme deal. People will remember that the Integrity Commissioner is an independent officer of the legislature. Stiles in her letter alleges that the NDP have evidence that suggests Therme received preferential treatment from the government, and the opposition wants an investigation into the Minister of Infrastructure's involvement. That minister, of course, is Kinga Surma. So the issue here is whether this was a properly constituted, competitive, open process, or whether it was something less than a open, transparent, competitive process, and if so, does that violate any of Ontario's, any section of Ontario's Integrity Act?
Do we know how long typically these Integrity Commissioner investigations take? It's months anyway, right?
Typical, but months would be, I think, fair. So I think if I can complete your thought there, the idea that the Integrity Commissioner may not report back on this matter before a possible spring election.
You might think that. I couldn't possibly comment. In other financial news, as they say, the province is going to reveal the state of Ontario's books on the 30th of October. It's the fall economic statement. We're hearing that the government plans to send a $200 check to every man, woman, and child, and everything in between in the province of Ontario. I don't think pets are included.
No, probably not. I think you actually have to be a human being.
You have to be a human.
Yeah.
So every human, $200 to offset the high cost of living. This, according to a story broken in the Toronto Star the other day. If this sounds familiar, it's because it is. Once again, we're going back to the days of Mike Harris, because when Ernie Eves was Mike Harris's finance minister, he did the same thing. He said, it's been a good year. We're going to give a dividend back to the people of Ontario. And he gave them, I think, what he called a tax rebate back in the day. Everything old is new again, right?
Going back to those classics, the difference being that, I mean, at the time of that a tax rebate or check or whatever, the Harris government was in fact running a surplus. The current Ford government, at least last time we checked, who knows, they might update the numbers with this fall economic statement, but the Ford government is not running a surplus. It was running a deficit of $9.8 billion as of the spring. So this move is likely to cost $3.2 billion. So unless the province's finances have improved dramatically, this would worsen a deficit.
Would you care to speculate whether a government that intended to send $200 checks out to every person in the province of Ontario might suggest that they were thinking a spring election is more likely?
Does one even need to speculate?
I don't think they do.
This is the kind of thing you would do if you were planning a spring election. I will add, though, that, before the 2020 U.S. election, a whole bunch of checks went out to American citizens signed by Donald Trump, and he still lost the 2020 election. I will just reiterate.
That's not what I heard. Yeah, no, I don't know about that. I'm not sure.
And we can talk about this more another time, perhaps, but the Ford government has been doing a lot to bolster its image before an election, and I'm not sure how much of this stuff actually sticks, right? Like, have you noticed like a huge surge in support for the PC party in the polling after the corner store beers got legalized?
Not a surge, but they're still in first place, so they are where they are.
And maybe it's just, reinforcing the foundation.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. And with that, we're off to the leader of the Ontario Greens. Here is Mike Schreiner, leader of the Ontario Green Party and the MPP for Guelph, and we'd like to, as we welcome you here to TVO, we want to thank you for dressing down. We do believe in casual Fridays here. And go ahead, what are you repping underneath that plaid shirt?
Well, I tell you what, it's the first time I've ever been in the studio without a suit on, and I know you guys like your T-shirt, so underneath this shirt is a We the North T-shirt that I picked up because I was lucky enough to get tickets to one of the playoff games during the big 2019 run. It was a triple overtime game with the Bucks.
Oh, nice.
Great game. And so this is the We the North shirt that was sitting on my seat when I sat down to watch that game.
Fantastic. So that's a lucky shirt.
That's a lucky shirt, and we're hoping for a good season this year, better than last year.
Amen. Over to you, sir.
Okay, so let's start with some of the big developments from just the past few days. If it is true that the government intends to send everybody a $200 check that they're going to announce in the fall economic statement later this month, how would you react to that?
Well, it's just extraordinarily irresponsible from a financial standpoint. I don't understand why billionaires and millionaires are going to get a $200 check at a cost of $3.2 billion when our healthcare system is collapsing. 2.5 million Ontarians don't have access to a doctor. We're closing emergency departments. We have long wait times. Children are learning in overcrowded classrooms. We have an unprecedented level of people experiencing homelessness. I think there are better ways to spend $3.2 billion than sending Steve Paikin a $200 check.
I shouldn't comment on that at all, but you're not wrong. Let me ask you about nuclear power. The Green Party has always cared a lot about nuclear power. The organization that monitors the safety of our nuclear power plants has decided that Pickering B, the 4 reactors at Pickering B, are in good enough shape to warrant extending the lifespan of that plant by 2 years beyond what the original closing date was supposed to be, which I think was an extension of beyond what the original closing date was supposed to be. Are you okay with that?
No, but I'm okay with Darlington and Bruce because we know they've been rebuilt. We know they're going to be a part of Ontario's electricity supply for the next few decades. Pickering is one of the worst performing nuclear plants in North America. Out of the 65 in North America, it usually rates 64. So why are we pouring money into a plant that historically hasn't operated well and that's about 10 years past its best before date when we have cheaper, cleaner options? Solar power now is the cheapest source of electricity generation anywhere in the world. That's why investors poured $465 billion into wind and solar last year. Why not go with the cheapest, cleanest solution, knowing that, yes, nuclear power will be part of our electricity mix for years to come?
Do you think because that plant is in the finance minister's riding, that has anything to do with it?
It could be. I have no idea why they would want to put money into such a poor performing nuclear plant. Like I said, fine with Darlington and Bruce. They've already mostly been rebuilt. This is going to be part of our supply for a long time to come. But I think Ontarians want us to invest in cheap, clean power. That's wind, water, solar, and storage.
What about the expansion that they're proposing at Bruce, a third site at Bruce, Bruce C?
Again, I would say when it comes to new nuclear, why wouldn't we go with the cheapest power, which is wind, water, solar, and storage? That's why global investors are pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into wind and solar, because the price has come down so much. It's now the lowest cost source of generation. I don't know about you two, but I want us to go with the cheapest, cleanest power.
But they say it's not baseload, right? You can't get baseload on a wind and solar, they say. You
That's
need
right.
nukes for that.
Yeah, and that's why I'm not opposed to Bruce and Darlington being rebuilt and being part of the energy mix. That, along with Niagara Falls, will provide baseload power. And now we can, as we build out new power, and we're going to need that power if we want to decarbonize transportation and buildings to address climate and to help people save money at the same time. Let's go with the cheapest, cleanest power.
Well, speaking of cheapest and cleanest, let's talk about the opposite of that. The proposed tunnel under the 401. What do you think?
Well, I think the Premier has lost all fiscal restraint whatsoever. If he's going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars tunneling under the 401, hand out $3.2 billion worth of $200 checks to people at a time when our healthcare system has almost collapsed. The OMA just came out the other day saying that our healthcare system is in a state of catastrophe right now. We have overcrowded classrooms. We have unprecedented number of people experiencing homelessness. We have a whole generation of young people wondering if they'll ever be able to own a home. And the Premier is saying we're going to build a tunnel under the 401. I'm sorry, what about all the people living along Eglinton right now? We've been tunneling that for a decade and we still don't have transit. Like, let's talk to this Premier. Let's get transit built. The only way we're going to solve gridlock is if we build out transit, we make our streets safe enough for people to have choices around cheaper options like cycling, walking, and if we start building homes that people can afford in the communities they know and love close to where they work. This tunnel idea is a ridiculous distraction from the Premier's failures on housing, healthcare, and infrastructure.
So worth doing a feasibility study?
No.
I mean, that's what he's committed to so far.
You're a Red Sox fan, right? Right, Steve. You probably know about the big dig in Boston. Hugely over budget, cost billions more than expected, and it didn't solve gridlock. I just came in on the 401 in my electric vehicle. About a year or so ago, they finished the widening of the 401, and for about 3 months, it was great. Now it's pure gridlock again. We have 50 years of history showing that when you build new highways, you expand existing highways, it just leads to more gridlock. Let's actually start bringing forward a serious plan to address gridlock, not these fantasy plans that will be a financial nightmare and not solve the problem.
There is one good thing about the Big Dig in Boston. It's named after Ted Williams, who was the greatest hitter who ever lived. So let's just remember that.
We'll give him one good thing.
Let's remember that. Let's talk the waterfront in Toronto, Ontario Place, the spa, all of that business. There's a lot of split opinion about that thing. Some people think it's going to be okay by the time it's all said and done. What's your view?
You know what? Over and over again, the Ford government has put the interest of wealthy, well-connected insiders ahead of what's good for everyday people, whether it's the $8.3 billion Greenbelt scandal, whether it's the Therm mega spa, whether it's the closing of the Science Center. Over and over again, this government prioritizes wealthy, well-connected insiders over everyday people. Ontario Place is public land. It should be utilized for a public purpose. Like, this lease on the spa is going to be the Ford government's 407, another bad deal for Ontarians.
You mentioned healthcare earlier. It's obviously a primary provincial responsibility. And yet, as you say, it seems to have at least as many problems today as it did 6 years ago when the Conservatives first won that election. Give us an example. Tell us something that they should be doing to make things better in healthcare that they are currently not doing.
Well, first of all, let's have Ontario not be the least funded healthcare system in the entire country. I know money's not going to solve every problem, but when you're last in per capita funding for healthcare, you're going to see the type of crisis we're seeing. So I think the first thing is we have to invest more in primary healthcare. 2.5 million Ontarians without a family physician or a nurse practitioner or primary health care provider is unacceptable, and that puts additional costs on the entire system because people are sicker then if they don't have access to primary care. That puts more pressure on our health, on our hospitals. People who may be able to be cared for at home, accessing primary care, now being forced into long-term care, putting more pressure on our long-term care systems. So I think it's starting with primary care, but it's also investing in all aspects of our healthcare system, especially when it comes to the people who deliver healthcare. I mean, Bill 124, the wage restraint legislation, has been a disaster for our healthcare system. We've seen so many early retirements of nurses, technicians, doctors, other frontline healthcare workers because they've been disrespected, they've been underpaid, and they've had very poor working conditions. And I understand why so many people have left the profession. We need to attract those workers back, because we won't have care for us as people if we don't care for the people who care for us.
The treasurer is about to have to write a check for more than $4 billion in order to pay back all of the wage suppression that took place. So that money's coming back into the system and into the pockets of the people who you just referenced. Is that going to help?
Well, some of it's too little too late because so many people have already left the system. I remember giving a very fiery speech against Bill 124 in the legislature, and a few members of the Conservative caucus, after I spoke, came up to me and said, "Mike, was that a political show, or do you really believe what you just said?" And I said, "I really believe it, because this is going to end up costing us more. It's going to cost us more financially, because eventually this is going to be declared unconstitutional, and it's going to cost us more because we're going to lose good people, and it is very hard to get people back. I can tell you, as a small business owner, one of the things I always wanted to avoid was high turnover in my companies, because I knew how much it cost to train people, to get them up to speed, to have them know how the systems work. That's what's happening in healthcare right now. And so one of the costs of that is, like, we've seen this huge rise in private agency nurses, which is costing our hospitals, our long-term care homes, way more money, which would have been better off if we'd actually paid people reasonable wages, and then you'd have a steady, reliable workforce.
Let me ask you about housing. Tell us one, the government thinks it's got a good story to tell on housing. Tell us one thing they should be doing, they're not doing, to encourage more housing development.
Legalize fourplexes and 4 stories as of right.
They don't want to do that.
They don't want to do that. That is the cheapest, fastest way to build more homes that people can afford in the communities they know and love, close to where they work, so they don't have these horrible long commutes, or people don't have to drive until they qualify for a mortgage. And then the second thing they can do is actually invest in government-assisted nonprofit co-op and social housing. 93% of the deeply affordable homes built in the province of Ontario were built before 1995. No wonder we're in a situation where there's no city in Ontario where a minimum wage worker can afford a 1-bedroom apartment. No wonder we have so many people experiencing homelessness, because we have failed. We collectively have failed to invest in deeply affordable homes. So those are the 2 things I would say the Premier should do immediately. And then finally, we need protections for renters. Far too many people are being rent evicted, and then they don't have an affordable place to live. So to me, this is the number one issue. When I talk to Ontarians, this is their number one issue. People tell me over and over again, you have to address the housing crisis. The Ontario Greens have put forward a bold plan to do that, and we just need the Premier to stop saying no to it.
Last year was a good year for the Green Party. You doubled the size of your caucus. You have 2 MPPs now. What do you think separates the Ontario Greens from the other parties at Queen's Park?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is, and we really saw this in Kitchener Centre, is that our MPPs are champions for their communities. Ashlyn Clancy's boss, people of Kitchener Centre, not Mike Schreiner. And I'll never forget the day that she made her first vote in the legislature. And I turned around, she sits right behind me, and I turned around and I said, "Ashlyn, do you know how you're going to vote on this one?" And like everybody around me was like, "What? You're not telling her how to vote?" I said, "No, I'm not her boss. The people of Kitchener Centre are her boss." I think we need more of that at Queen's Park. I think the other thing that separates us is, we tend to be the leaders when it comes to housing policy, climate policy, addressing legislated poverty, and the other parties follow. And I think it's one of the reasons it's so important to have green voices at Queen's Park. And your follow-up question should be, well, what prevents more people from voting green? And all the polling data we've seen says people like our values, they like our vision, they like our policy priorities. Their number one concern is, can you win? And now that we've won twice, and when Greens win, we win by a landslide. And I think it's because a lot of people want to vote Green, but they're hesitant to because, up until this year, we've only elected one Green. Now we've elected two. We've doubled our caucus, and we're confident that we can grow in the next election.
Since you're telling him what question to ask, what question should I ask next? No, never mind. I'm going to...
Ask me about my favorite baseball team.
I got a feeling we may differ on that one.
I think we will.
If Premier Ford wants to call an election next spring, a year before he is legislatively mandated to do so, what would your view be of that?
I would say the Premier is putting politics ahead of what's good for the people of Ontario. I'd say to the Premier, you know what? There are so many challenges people are facing right now that, let's focus on solving the housing crisis, shoring up our healthcare and education systems, getting our communities ready for climate. My gosh, this rainstorm that hit the GTA over the summer cost over $1 billion in damage. We are clearly not ready. Let's focus on actually putting forward solutions to make lives of everyday people better instead of playing politics around an early election call.
Finally, I believe you and I have something in common. You're a dual U.S.-Canadian citizen, is that correct?
I am. Yes.
Are you planning to vote in the upcoming election? And if so, for whom?
So when I was elected MPP in 2018, I haven't voted since then in a U.S. election. And I didn't feel comfortable being an elected member of provincial parliament in Ontario and voting in another country's election. Right. So I haven't voted since then. Prior to that, I did. And you could probably guess who I'm going to vote for if I was going to vote.
What state would you be registered in?
Indiana, actually, because it was the last
Oh.
state that I lived in. So I grew up in Kansas on a farm in rural western Kansas. And but the last state I registered to vote in was Indiana. So that's technically where I would vote.
I would be registered in New York if I were registered to
Okay.
vote. And I have comforted myself by saying that I don't think my vote is going to change the outcome in that particular state.
Nor would his.
Nor in Indiana. I think it's pretty clear where Indiana and New York are going to fall.
So are you originally a Kansas City Royals fan?
I was a Royals
You were
fan.
a Royals
George
fan.
Brett. I still have a George Brett signed baseball glove.
Greatest player in that franchise's history.
Yeah, he was fantastic.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure was. Mike Schreiner, leader of the Green Party of Ontario and the MPP for Guelph, we thank you very much for coming into TVO tonight. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay, it's time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for TVO.org over the past week. Start us off, if you would, sir.
Right. I wrote about the incoming regulatory restrictions on bike lanes that we talked about earlier. And the point I wanted to make is that, I looked at a few examples from Toronto City Council recently. And I think progressive voters generally really do defend the idea of well-meaning, well-intentioned regulations that they think can address or prevent harms. And the point I wanted to make is that nobody pretends that this proposal on bike lanes is really anything other than an attempt to stop bike lanes from going in. I mean, the government is hostile to bike lanes. They are introducing a measure to make it more difficult to build bike lanes. This is plain as day. And I would hope that people could take that insight and apply it elsewhere, in particular in housing, where I think that there is too much deference given to the idea that a lot of rules are well-intentioned and are intended to keep people from being harmed by the sight of a two-story home next to their front lawn or whatever. In this case, it was a city councillor trying to bring in new rules against laneway houses in a very, very niche specific part of the city, instead of just the general principle that these are we're talking about tiny homes built in people's backyards that maybe we could actually just get around to agreeing that they should just be allowed and be built where they're needed. So I think people should, people need to keep in mind that even well-intentioned rules are a way that governments use to smother things.
Would you say this is further evidence that the Premier of Ontario is actually some days more interested in being the mayor of Toronto?
That is one of those allegations that goes around, and boy, going back to 2018, right? What is his first act as premier when they recall the legislature? It's cutting Toronto City Council in half.
Cut council in half, exactly.
What interests me about that allegation is that it doesn't seem to play outside of Toronto. That you could imagine a scenario in which rural Ontarians were quite upset at the fact that the PC party is led by a Toronto MPP, and frequently this government is seized by matters that are either central to Toronto or at most the 905. You could wonder why that. I mean, it does not seem to have hurt the PC party very much in rural Ontario, but that is perhaps a matter for another time.
Yes, indeed.
So what about you, Steve?
You and I have known thousands of politicians over the years, and
Bit of a lopsided ratio there. On average, we've known thousands, but
maybe we've known a few together. Without doubt, the most joyous, the most optimistic, the most, you want to talk sunny ways? Like I know the Prime Minister campaigned on that in 2015. This guy lived it his whole time in public life. An MP from Willowdale by the name of Jim Peterson. First got elected in 1980. I think he lost the next election, but then he came back in 88. He won in, he kept winning and winning and winning, and I think he finally left public life in 2007. He died last May at the age of 82. There was a celebration of life for him at the Royal Conservatory of Music in downtown Toronto a week or so ago. I think we have a picture of it here, which we can show. And it was a packed house. Oh, that's lovely there. A little glass of wine, a little candle, and a beautiful picture of Jim Peterson. The Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, came to speak. You probably will know the name Peterson from politics because he was the oldest of three brothers born in London. The middle kid was a guy named David Peterson, who was Premier of Ontario in the 1980s. The third boy was named Tim Peterson. And David and Tim are still around. They were at the celebration of life. Tim was an MPP at Queen's Park for a term as well. Do you know who showed up to this thing? Mikhail Baryshnikov.
Oh, wow.
Came up from the States. You got to go way back here. Jim Peterson was part of a team that helped the man who at the time was the greatest ballet dancer in the world from the Soviet Union. They helped him defect here in Toronto. And Baryshnikov came all the way here for this celebration of life, gave a speech that was maybe a minute long. What do you say about Jim Peterson? Yeah. He gave me my freedom. Thank you, Jim Peterson. Thank you, Canada. That was all he said, and he sat down. The house roared. Jim Peterson met his wife, Heather, if you can imagine this, in grade 9. They were together for almost 70 years. He was a very kind individual. You might even think too kind for politics, which is not known for its kindness. He had a lot of integrity. Whenever you asked Jim Peterson, how you doing, he would say, terrific, with 5 R's in there. And he always said that because he always was. Anyway, Jim Peterson, rest in peace. You were a terrific guy, I got to say. And that is the onpoli podcast for this October 18th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sheldon, if you would, bring this graphic up. Because, and for those listening on podcast, I'll just read the chart that we've got going here. We're tracking the price of gold since 2020 to today. And it is currently trading at record levels, north of $2,600 an ounce, and that's in American funds. So it's up there. Sean, starting with you, what factors are pushing the price of gold so high these days?
There's been a lot of central bank buying over the last 2 to 3 years, largely from China. So gold's reacting to that, so good demand. Supply is constrained. It's not growing dramatically even at these high prices. As you mentioned in the top, it's tough. It's a tough business. It's tough to find quantities of gold in economic quantities where you can actually build a mine. So the supply-demand fundamentals are really strong, and it's likely going to continue to go higher.
Well, I'm going to follow up with Bruce on that. It's $2,600 US an ounce right now. Can it sustain that in your view?
Well, yes, because the very interesting thing about gold right now, Sean was absolutely correct that central banks around the world, particularly non-G7 countries, have been accumulating it a lot. But a lot of consumers in China, retail people, have been a big reason for this as well. There's been a lot of trouble in the Chinese economy. There's been a lack of faith in their real estate with some of their major real estate companies collapsing, and there's not been a lot of faith in the Xi government and in some of the policies, and so they've been reaching out for gold for safety. We're going to look at part of the world.
Gotcha. We're going to look at another chart now. This is the production of gold in Canada, province by province, And we're looking at a pie chart again for those listening on podcast and who can't see this chart. 2% in Manitoba, 2% in the Yukon, 10% in BC, 26% in Quebec, a good chunk, 14% elsewhere, 46% of Canadian gold production is done in the province of Ontario, almost half. And here's another chart we're going to show as well. This is Ontario's producing gold mines, and there are 17 of them, and they are, as you might suspect, primarily in northern Ontario around Timmins, Kirkland Lake, and Red Lake, which is north of Thunder Bay. That is way up there north of Thunder Bay. And Sean, let me go back to you here. How many gold mines does Agnico Eagle operate in Ontario?
We operate the Kirkland Lake Macassa mine, which the mayor would be familiar with, and the Detour Lake mine. And the Detour Lake is a sizable mine. It's in the top 10 in the world. And we also have the Canadian Malartic mine across the border in Quebec, which is also top 10.
I'm sure the mayor is well aware of it, which is why I'm going to ask her how important it is to her economy in Kirkland Lake.
Well, absolutely. We've always been a gold-based economy over the last century, and we are very, very fortunate. Not only do we have that Macassa mine site within our borders, of course, we have Alamos Gold over in Matach and the promise of Upper Beaver as well, just down the highway on the other side.
And how important is it to you that gold continues to trade at $2,600 an ounce U.S. and more?
Absolutely. So we definitely are keenly aware that that is good news for the local economy and the surrounding areas.
Michael, let's go to you. How many First Nations residents work in this sector in the province or country?
Well, that's a good question. It's probably the highest proportionally hired by the mining industry compared to other sectors. I think those areas you mentioned, there's a high percentage of Indigenous communities involved in the mining operations, either in the training or in the operations as employment or in the business.
And if they're not working actually in the business itself, maybe in spin-off industries, what are they doing?
So they could be trucking, they could be providing supplies, janitorial materials. There's a whole supply chain that these mining operations provide opportunities for the Indigenous communities.
Is it working?
It's totally working. I would argue that over time, there's been an evolution of Indigenous participation to Indigenous partnerships to Indigenous proponents within the sector.
How old were you when you were diagnosed?
Yeah, it's a funny question because I was diagnosed as a kid, very young age, which as a girl, that's a little bit less usual. But I was first diagnosed with anxiety. So you mentioned that a lot of women are diagnosed with another mental health condition first, and that was absolutely my experience. I exhibited a lot of the symptoms that you see with the self-regulation, not just with my attention, but also emotions, impulse control, with that combined presentation of ADHD. So I had the tantrums, the meltdowns, the irritability if I was having a sensory overload that day. And that presented as a lot of just conflict with the people around me, conflict at home, and reactiveness. And so
how early in the game?
Age 6 or 7.
6 or 7, eh?
And so then that ended up with me accessing some mental health resources, getting a diagnosis with anxiety. And it wasn't until a few months after that where I was doing some follow-up on that with the anxiety meds when my doctor said, you're bouncing off the walls. Do you think maybe there's something else happening here? And so then I got the diagnosis closer to age 8, but still 7.
Did you think there was something off about you?
As a kid?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You did. You could feel that you were different from the other kids.
Yeah, I was, and I think some of that might have been my own anxiety, but I definitely internalized this feeling that I was a bad kid. It was really hard to regulate my emotions, so I would say things that I didn't mean. I would make decisions that I didn't want to make. And no amount of telling myself not to do that again would change it. And as a kid, that's really frustrating. But you don't have the language at age 7, 8, 9 to articulate that. So I think a lot of the therapy that I went through as a kid was just unlearning that. Before I was able to manage the ADHD, I had to just be able to regulate enough and change my narrative about myself.
This has surely got to be one of the worst aspects of ADHD, is that a young child thinks of themselves as being bad. Not as being, having some issues to deal with, but being bad. What's the consequence of feeling that way?
I think that's one of the myths that we see around ADHD is that the kid is just being bad. And that's one of the reasons sometimes people don't seek out a diagnosis. They feel, oh, that'll label my kid. But I think the labeling, being called it's ADHD, actually gives people a roadmap. It gives them something to do. It tells them, hey, the kid isn't bad. They have a condition. It can be treated. There's something you can do about it. So I think not knowing what it is, just seeing the behavior often gets people labeled as being bad. Teachers will often say, hey, your kid is bad. They're disrupting the class. While getting help, just it helps that quite a bit.
How many kids you got?
3 boys.
3 boys. Any of them have this?
All 3.
All 3.
And my husband.
And your husband?
Yes.
So do you assume the boys got it from the husband?
Yes, although, I can probably see traces in some sides of, my background as well, from different people in the family. But
so these stories of kids going to school and being called bad kids, you experience with that?
Yes and no, more so with my grandson. My 3 boys were all gifted, so they weren't failing school, so they were doing okay. But the interesting thing was they had enough inhibitory qualities that they saved it all for us at home. So they would be okay at school, and then they'd come home and all hell would break loose. Like you can imagine 3 boys with ADHD in a household with one of the parents with ADHD. So when I present to parents, I always say, I really, really wish I knew then what I know now. Life would have been so much easier for everybody and so much better for the kids.
Tell us what that means. If you'd known then what you know now, how would things have been different?
It would have been advocating in the school system to get them, the help they needed. They weren't failing, but they also weren't diagnosed and got the support as being gifted, right? So they did fine till they got to post-secondary, and then it was kind of like a 2x4 between the eyes, right? Because all the organizational difficulties, the time management, all of that stuff really hit them hard because they didn't have to do a whole lot of studying until then, right? So, and yeah, the emotional dysregulation that Caitlin talked about, and that was, a lot of our family life's experience, different kids dysregulating and a lot of fighting.
I'm going to direct your eyes to the screens over there. According to the Government of Canada Job Bank, in 2023, the median wage for a registered nurse in Ontario was $38.05 per hour. In December 2023, the Auditor General released a report on emergency departments that found agency nurses in hospitals were paid more than $75 per hour, with some higher rates in Northern Ontario. And in July of last year, the Ontario Nurses Association asked hospitals to submit data from 2022, and it shared it with the Globe and Mail to show that there were more than 1 million total reported hours worked by agencies in hospitals. And they charged on average, not median, wage of $140 per hour, with a total bill of more than $168 million in the reported time. All right. On one hand, nurses and staffing agencies are getting paid more. That's a good thing. People are getting paid for the work they do. On the other hand, it seems to be costing hospitals much more. So I'm going to start with Lamo. What are we supposed to do here?
So I think the problem is much deeper than just a cost reimbursement for agency nurses in work settings, because we have to look at the agencies have always been there for decades. Having said that, the price, the steep price hike that we see has been because of the nursing shortage crisis that has been more highlighted more so since COVID. On top of that, Bill 124 was another damper where it did have a significant negative impact on the nursing morale, and of course the work plus the workload and the high burnout rates was enough for nurses to think about exiting the profession in total, which led us to a huge nursing shortage crisis. That also gave rise to a lot of agency nurses being utilized and hence the steep cost. So if you are going to look at agency nurses were charging $75 an hour, and now you have 140 to 250, if you can see some of the reports up north, $250 an hour, which is in general a huge healthcare cost, because this is our taxpayer money that we are paying to these private agencies to deliver care, and these nurses are one of our own. So it's a bigger problem. The cost is just the tip of the iceberg.
All right, Rosalie, I'm going to get you to respond as well.
Yeah, well, I've got maybe a bit of a different perspective, because it certainly is true that we do have a shortage of nurses, particularly in some care settings. However, when you actually look at the overall labor stats, employment in healthcare has actually grown more than the rest of the economy, even when wages in Ontario particularly weren't growing at the same rate and keeping up with inflation. So it's actually a bit more complex than just not having enough, because we're actually adding more nurses than we are in more people to work in healthcare than we are in other areas of the economy. And though the prices for agency nurses might be high, fully 63.3% of hospital spending is already directed towards compensation. So one of my concerns is about how filling staffing gaps might be crowding out other areas of care, or limiting hospitals and how much they might be able to invest in things that could make work better or improve outcomes for patients. So overall, I think it does put hospitals in a bit of a budget crunch, but I don't see it as strictly a shortage issue. I see it as a much more complex change in what we actually consider to be the health sector.
Okay. Charlene, I'm curious, it's not just the province of Ontario. A report last month projected that $1.5 billion will be spent nationwide on agencies, a six-fold increase from pandemic levels. Is this a trend that's going to be moving forward?
Thank you. Well, it appears that it is. And I would argue that the staffing crisis is real. I mean, yes, there's been a lot of hiring over the past year, a lot of incentives to attract nurses into the sector. And I represent primarily registered practical nurses across the country. So the crisis is the same, and the agencies are being relied upon to fill those jobs as well. And there is different levels of dependency. I mean, hospitals is one, but also in long-term care, they're being utilized as well, where, the funding is different, but we don't have the extra resources to be spending on agencies. And this is a critical thing that the country needs to deal with.
And that is the agenda for Friday, October 18th, 2024. Monday on the program, we'll get an insider's look into what role artificial intelligence is playing in the U.S. election. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll see you again on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.